Halloween is fast approaching and I'm an avid reader, so I thought I would rack my brains and see if I could come up with my personal top 10 horror novels. Not, I suppose, the top 10 horror novels of all time. I haven't read enough books to think about making a list, anything like that, but this is my personal top 10 out of what I've read. So, they're sort of in order, and we'll start with my absolute favourite, although we could jumble these around a little bit, I guess. It's very hard to put them in a very specific order. Also, some of you are going to think, well, that's not really horror, that's science fiction in some of these titles. Truth is, I found it difficult to pick out a top 10 horror novels list because maybe it's because horror is kind of a weak genre or something. I don't know. I read a lot more horror books in my teens than I do currently. I'm more into science fiction. So I selected, some of these are horror, but some of them are science fiction with horror elements to it, put it that way. Anyway, let's jump straight in here with number 1, which is The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. A book that is very well known. It's been made into a movie in probably the 1960s. My introduction to it was the 1980s BBC television serial, 6-part serial, which had an absolutely terrifying opening sequence for like a 10-year-old boy. Loved it. Didn't know it was based on a novel really. Didn't care at the time, but I discovered the novel in high school, loved it, and fell in love with the writing of John Wyndham. And I'm close to having read all of his work at this point. The Triffids is probably not his best book, but it's definitely his best horror/sci-fi book, The Day of the Triffids. And it was also made into another series, I think in 2009, starring Eddie Izzard, but that one wasn't very good, and the movie isn't very good either. I do recommend the 1980s series though. But anyway, what's this about? It's about plants, large plants that can walk and eat people. And it sounds like the silliest thing ever, but if you read this book, it's anything but. It just shows the skill of John Wyndham, that he could take a concept so outrageous and turn it into something that almost sounds possible in the arena of mutation, biological mutation. I mean, we do have the Venus flytrap after all, which does eat meat, essentially a meat-eating plant. So it's kind of like the Venus flytrap writ large. So as the story goes, I'll fill you in on a little bit of how it begins. Triffids have been around for decades, and they're being farmed for the oil they produce. So it's kind of a controlled population. They've got these big stings that can shoot out from the top of them, from the top of the stem, typically to aim at someone's head. And if you get stung, you get poisoned, you'll be unconscious, and then the Triffid can feed off you. But it's controlled. I mean, they're no match for human beings, really. So they're farmed. And the oil is very precious because there's oil shortages, as we know. But then there's an event that happens which is some kind of comet display. And we know it's coming. It's all over the news. The news is going, make sure you watch tonight, everybody, because the comet is coming. And it's going to be the most amazing thing anyone's ever seen in the sky. And it happens, and everybody watches it, but there's a few people can't watch it because one circumstance or another. And one of these is a guy called Bill, who works with Triffids. And he has suffered a minor Triffid sting to the eyes. So he is sitting in hospital with bandages over his eyes when all this is going on, and he's hoping that he's not going to end up blind. So he can't watch the light show. And then one day he wakes up expecting it's the day the bandages are supposed to come off, but no one comes to give him his morning cup of tea. And he's wondering why. And he hears the chimes. Is it the chimes of Big Ben? Possibly. But he hears the chimes of a local clock, and he can tell it's something like 8 o'clock in the morning. But there's no traffic. and he's getting scared. So eventually he takes the bandages off himself, and he discovers, this is all in the first chapter by the way, this is not really a spoiler, he discovers that he is in a world now populated by the blind. Everyone who watched the comet has ended up blind. So he's one of the very few people that can see. So imagine an entire helpless population, and one man or a handful of people can't possibly help an entire population to survive. So there's mass starvation everywhere begins to occur. But also the Triffid farms are no longer being manned, and the Triffid, it's not so much that the Triffids get out, well they do, but the seeds also get out, and the seeds spread everywhere. So there's no one around to chop down a baby Triffid growing somewhere, and then it grows up and it becomes a danger to everybody. So the Triffid population gets out of control. So these two things, the fact that there are Triffids, and then the fact that this comet blinds the entire world, sets the basis for this apocalyptic novel. And the author Brian Aldiss is fond of saying that John Wyndham likes to write cozy catastrophes. I hate that expression. There's nothing cozy whatsoever about the day of the Triffids. Imagine being alive and seeing a helpless population that you can't help, even though you feel the tugs of your own conscience to help everybody that you hear crying or screaming on the street, but you can't physically do it. There's nothing cozy about it. And they're all going to die, and you're going to be one of the few people who survives to rebuild civilization. Yeah. It's an excellent novel. Really recommend it. That's number one. Number two on my list is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. This has been filmed 3 times, possibly 4. The first and most faithful adaptation of the book was called The Last Man on Earth, it's a black and white film starring Vincent Price, was it? I think. And then the next one was The Omega Man, starring Charlton Heston in the 70s. That was fun. And then we had I Am Legend, keeping the proper title of the book, starring Will Smith. Around 2007 was that, thereabouts. That was really good. But the only one there's a fourth one I said. The fourth one is I Am Omega. But whether you can call that a real adaptation or not, I don't know. It's done by a studio that is renowned for ripping off other intellectual properties. I think they had one called Universal Soldiers because there was Universal Soldier. They had one called Terminators because there was Terminator. And they do these ultra low budget rip-offs to try and fool people into spending their money. So they did I Am Omega. I've seen it and it's actually sort of okay. But yeah, not a movie that I'd be in a hurry to watch again anytime soon. The only one of the 3 movies that has had the courage to actually follow through the novel, I haven't even told you what it's about yet, but the only one of the 3 or 4 that has had the courage to follow through with the original ending of the novel is, I'm not going to tell you what the ending is, but it's the very first one, The Last Man on Earth. Yeah, that's the best of them all, I have to say, although I suppose the most entertaining is probably I Am Legend. It's kind of funny that, the ending very much ties into the title, I Am Legend, but the movie didn't go that way, it went another way. The title of the movie doesn't really make an awful lot of sense, doesn't carry an awful lot of meaning the way it does in the book and in the first movie adaptation. Anyway, what's this about? Well, basically it's another post-apocalyptic story set after the end of the world, some sort of viral outbreak that has killed everyone or turned them into, those it didn't kill, it turned into vampires, I suppose is the right word. It's kind of like a rewriting of the vampire mythology in a very scientific way. So these vampires, they are visible in mirrors. It doesn't go down the supernatural route. But they do, I think, drink blood. I don't think they have the enlarged teeth. It's been ages since I've read this, maybe they do. But they are averse to sunlight. They can't come out in the daytime. They are averse to garlic. So if you imagine you're one human being and you're living in your house in the middle of a city which you have fortified, and by day you can walk the city streets just fine, but at night you have to turn on all your lights and activate all your defenses because the vampire population comes out, and they come out to play and they come out to taunt you because you're the last man, and they want to kill you basically. But you're always searching for a cure, right? So that's how this novel goes. Really, probably Richard Matheson's best novel. He's certainly well known for this one, I Am Legend. Superb horror sci-fi. In the number 3 position is The Death of Grass by John Christopher. His real name is Sam Youde. He's probably most well known for his Tripods series of books, and that's probably my favourites out of the books that he has. I've read about 16 or 17 of his books. That's probably my favourite set of everything that he's written. But he wrote a lot of stuff for young adult or children's audiences. Back when he was writing them, young adult and children's fiction was the same thing, but they really are young adult novels. But The Death of Grass is part of an earlier part of his career where he was writing science fiction for adults. And it's about what would happen if all the grass died. Now by grass we mean grasses. So we're talking about corn, we're talking about all the different types of grass that form produce that we eat. And if the grass dies, that's a real problem because there's a whole ecological system built around it. Think of everything that's dependent on the grass, not just us, right? So there's not going to be, cattle can't graze anymore, you know. The only thing maybe wouldn't be affected is something like potatoes or fish in the sea. So there's mass starvation, mass panic. And this novel concerns one group of people on the move, led by, I forget the character's name, but they're heading across the country to a place where he has a brother that has fortified his farmhouse against attackers, and he hopes that his brother will take him in and it'll be a safe place to live amid the chaos. The real thrust of this novel and what makes it so good is how we would have to rewrite our morality when faced with such a dire circumstance. For instance, if you and your loved ones are going to starve, but you know that all you have to do to keep them alive is steal from another group of people who are just trying to survive. Is it right or wrong to do it? Would you do it? These kinds of questions. That's what. And if you have to commit murder, would you do it? If literally your survival depended on killing another innocent person, would you do it? It's a very grown-up novel. It's very dark, but it makes us grapple with these very deep questions. Excellent novel. I've read it twice in my life. I'm sure I'll read it again. In the next position, I have placed, no surprise to horror readers, a Stephen King novel. Well, technically a novelette or a novella. And you may have guessed already, it's The Mist by Stephen King, which is found in his collection called Skeleton Crew. That's where you'll find that. It's about 120 pages long. I've read about 40 Stephen King books in my life, and I'm casting my mind over them. What do I pick as my favourite horror title? And that's the one really that climbs right to the top of the pile for me, The Mist. And it's all about people trapped in a supermarket when one day this mist comes over everything outside, but in the mist are curious creatures, hostile, predatory creatures, like weird things that only really belong in a monster movie, but they're real. And they've come out of something called the Arrowhead Project. It's some sort of local military installation. So everyone's trapped in the supermarket, and not everybody believes what's going on, and they're trying to figure out a way out of this dire situation. Again, I've read it a few times. It's brilliant. And it was made into a really good movie by Frank Darabont. If you've seen the movie but never read the novella, the endings differ. So they're both good, but that's maybe a reason to read the novella if you haven't. In my number, oh by the way, I should say, I mean, I've read about 40 Stephen King books, so I'm making a rule for myself in this top 10 list. I should have said at the beginning, I'm not going to allow myself to feature one author more than once. So one book by one author, just so that we get a diverse range of authors on offer here. So that's the Stephen King slot filled. There's not going to be another Stephen King slot. If I had a number 2 for Stephen King, I'd probably add Revival, but I haven't. So we go on to the next one. My real number 5 then is Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. Again, it's been made into a movie starring Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise. Great movie. The book is even better. It's a vampire story told traditional vampires, except it's one of the, I don't know if any writer did this before. Of course, I've never read Dracula, so I'm not sure, but to make us sympathize with the vampires, the main characters are the vampires. So it's particularly one called Louis. He's a vampire who's been turned into a vampire by Lestat. That's Tom Cruise in the movie. And but he hates it. He can't quite bring himself just to kill indiscriminately, whereas the Tom Cruise character does. But Brad Pitt, he wants to maintain his humanity. So it's a story about grappling with one's impulses, but it's actually, that's the lesser part of the story. It's more about what would really happen if you lived for centuries and centuries. What would happen to you as a person? It's about getting to the point where you feel you've lived too long. And this is interesting for people, if you're like me and you're philosophically inclined and you're thinking about, is there an afterlife? We don't like generally the thought that we have to die someday. But I do feel differently now as a 49-year-old man than I did as a 10-year-old boy. And you can never go back and feel what life is like as a 10-year-old. You just can't do that. You can't watch movies anymore without seeing all the patterns in the storytelling that you've seen 100 times before. Nothing can ever be truly new. You can never watch Star Wars for the first time, So everything, there's a cynicism I see in my life now that I didn't used to have. And it's a thing that comes out of experience. It's not really a bad cynicism, I don't think, but it comes out of acquired wisdom, But what would it feel like to live for centuries and centuries and to keep on acquiring experience? Would you get to the point where you don't want to live anymore? That's an interesting question. And that is what Louis is grappling with in this story. Yeah. There's also a section in the story, in the novel, that wasn't included in the film. The film is reasonably faithful, but there's a section it's a really good section of the book that was not put in the film. It's really worth your while to read it. Yeah. So the next one is a novel I only read in recent years, and it's The Wasp Factory by Iain Banks. Technically, I suppose it has no supernatural elements. Is it a horror novel? I think it is. It's a very dark and disturbing novel, which kind of makes it a horror novel in my opinion. It's about a boy who lives a fairly isolated life on a small island with his father, and he likes to do strange things. He has weird habits to do with rituals that he does with animal carcasses and animal bones and stuff like that. And you're looking at this and you're thinking, this is like maybe a psychopath in the making here. But he's the main character from which the perspective of the story is told. And he's a teenager, so as this is happening, his brother, who is, if I remember correctly, was in a mental institute, has broken out and is on his way back to the island. And he keeps phoning him. The brother who's escaped phones the guy on the island, so there's these regular phone calls. And it's one of those novels that you read, you have no idea where it's going. And it was just kind of a mesmerizing experience to read one that it was just so interesting because it was so strange. Yeah, you know, you're reading a person really on the fringes of society here, and the ending was a real surprise. A bit unlikely maybe, but it was a real surprise. I could see myself definitely reading that one again. The Wasp Factory by Iain Banks. Hasn't been made into a movie. Okay, is that the first one that hasn't been made into a movie? I think so. Next up, this is number 7. A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. Made into a movie by, what's his name? Stanley Kubrick. How could I forget the name Stanley Kubrick? Anyway, the novel came first. The novel is very short and very good. And again, it's so strange because it's from the perspective of, what'll I call him? An antisocial person. Antisocial in the sense of violent. Total disregard for other people's well-being. A young thug, a young teenage thug set in the near future, a kind of strange future where there's a strange, I can't remember what it's called, language works a little bit differently. There's a little dictionary in the back of the book that has all these futuristic slang terms that are used throughout the book. It's an examination of a teenager called Alex, who he's a complete thug. He can't be reasoned with, but he ends up being subjected to an experiment in mind control. And the question that it's a kind of a conditioning thing. The question that the book is really asking is, what is goodness? What is a truly moral act? If you are good because you've no other choice but to be good, is that real goodness? Because imagine you felt every time you wanted to do violence, you suddenly felt physically sick, right? So you weren't able to go through with the violence. Is that goodness? And it always used to, this story always used to, back when I was a Christian, I used to think about the way Christians talked about how we'd be perfected when we get to heaven. Down here we have the sinful nature that we grapple with, the flesh. But where in heaven we're perfected and we will not be capable of sin. And I always thought of that in the context of Alex in this novel, who was no longer capable of sin because his nature had been reshaped, artificially reshaped. But yet I couldn't say that was true goodness. So how is it true goodness if you're in heaven and you're incapable of sin? How is that moral? How is that truly good? You know what I mean? So this novel raises those kinds of questions. Very interesting. Next up is Invasion of the Body Snatchers by Jack Finney. Again, I'm sure you've heard of the movie, or rather movies of this. There are at least 3, possibly more. I love the first 2, the 1950s one in black and white. Then there was the 1970s one starring Donald Sutherland, probably my favourite adaptation. And there was one, I think, in the 1990s that was just called Body Snatchers, set in a military base, and as I recall, not terribly good. Yeah, there was one called The Invasion, starring Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig, is that right? And I think that's an adaptation of this, I think. Anyway, it's a really good novel. And as you know, basically these spores come from outer space and they land and they grow into these pods. And if you fall asleep near one of these large seed pods, a duplicate of you starts to grow inside the pod. And it starts to sap the life force out of you as it does this, so that it will wake up as your replacement and your body will crumble away. And it will be like you in every respect. It will have all of your memories. It just won't feel anything. No emotion. It's an alien organism that is an exact duplicate of you, but there's no emotion. It can fake emotion to blend in, but it doesn't actually feel any. There's no love, no hate, none of that. And the story is told from the perspective of a man, I think he's a psychiatrist, and he's divorced, and that's important actually. He's had a failed marriage, and he's got this new love interest in his life, a woman who has also had a failed marriage, and you can kind of tell that they've got this rapport and they're starting to hit it off. And this background of sort of a romantic failure sets the stage for this kind of subtext about, think of all the pain that these failed relationships have, and yet these aliens are offering a world without all that. No love, no hate, just peace. And yet they would rather take the risk. They would rather be who they are, take the risk, you know, have the joys and the sorrows. Somehow that's better than this terrible blandness that the aliens are offering. It's an interesting thing to think about. You know, the turbulence of our emotional lives could all just be taken away if we wanted it to. And I've made a video on this at one point where I kind of compared this to that esoteric spirituality that I resonate with, that non-duality, you know, the non-duality pod people, as I call it, where people just want to get away from their suffering, and they think they can change their consciousness in a way that allows that to happen. But if you really thought about it, you don't want that. You don't want all the colour and vitality drained out of your life like that. So that's Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Next up is a more light-hearted horror story than all of the others, and it's by Dean Koontz. So I've read about 15 of Dean Koontz's novels, and my firm favourite has to be Odd Thomas. Dean Koontz, I used to read him a lot in the past. I have a hard time with him now because he's very melodramatic, and I don't like melodrama. But the one exception to it, I think, is Odd Thomas, because the character Odd Thomas was just so interesting. He's a guy that has some sort of supernatural power. He's able to see these creatures that he calls bodaks, and they tend to swarm around places where terrible things are about to happen. It's almost like they're feeding off the energy that is building up at a spot where some kind of tragedy is going to happen. And they're just these horrible demonic looking things. So he can always tell where something terrible is going to happen because the bodaks arrive first. And he doesn't he doesn't allow them to know that he can see them, because he thinks if they realize that, they'll kill him. So that's his ability. And he also helps out ghosts. He's able to see the spirits of people who have died, who haven't yet passed on, who require his help. So it's kind of a crime fighting thing to some extent. And he has all this responsibility on his shoulders. So and this is the part that I like about his character, he has simplified his life dramatically, that he has no real possessions, or he doesn't own his own car, he doesn't own his own house. He has a job as a fry cook, basically. So he has this life that would be considered kind of like some people might consider that a failure, but he has this whole other life behind the scenes that that's a heroic life that no one really knows about. And there's a love interest in there, a girl called Stormy Llewellyn. People have strange names in this book. Yeah, if you want a light-hearted horror novel, Odd Thomas is a great read. He continued the Odd Thomas series. The second one's called Forever Odd, then Brother Odd, then I think it's In Odd We Trust. Is that the next one? And Odd Apocalypse. There's a whole bunch of them. I've only ever read the first 3. They kind of started to go downhill for me, although they were still interesting. But I really do recommend Odd Thomas. And the movie is great too. Yeah, check out the movie. So, we're on to my very last one, number 10. I had a hard time picking this, but I went for The Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft. This is a story about a man who travels to a seaside town where everyone's just a bit strange. They look a bit odd, they don't blink. There's just something off about all the people. And he stays in a hotel room. I can't remember what his business in town was, but he stays in a hotel room and he realizes that the townsfolk are coming to get him. So he makes this daring escape from the hotel room, and it's a really dramatically written scene, how he gets out. But I'll not spoil too much about the story. It's really, I mean, I'm featuring it technically, and again, you won't find this typically in book form. H.P. Lovecraft really only wrote short stories and novellas. I'm not even sure you could call this a novella, but it's one of his longer pieces, so I'm going to include it. But you will find it in various H.P. Lovecraft collections. The Shadow over Innsmouth, Innsmouth being the name of the town. And yeah, again, there's a subtext to this story. I'm going to tell you what the subtext is. It won't mean anything to you, but if you read it, you'll get it. The subtext is, be what you are. Now, there's a quote by Albert Camus that says, man is the only creature who refuses to be what he is. I used that quote in my book, A Universe, by the way. Man is the only creature who refuses to be what he is. So the thrust of this story is be what you are. That's all I'm going to say if it whets your appetite. The Shadow over Innsmouth. It has been filmed, but the film, and it's by Stuart Gordon, who did some other H.P. Lovecraft adaptations, including Reanimator. The film is called Dagon. Now, H.P. Lovecraft wrote a story called Dagon. So what Stuart Gordon has done is he's kind of smashed the story Dagon and the story The Shadow over Innsmouth together and created a kind of hybrid story that has elements of both. But trust me, Dagon, the movie, is mostly The Shadow over Innsmouth. He runs roughshod over some of the mythology of H.P. Lovecraft. When we see Dagon, it's actually Cthulhu. You know, you can tell because of the tentacles coming down that it's Cthulhu. But and there's even the chants of the worshippers are Ia Ia Cthulhu Fatagan, which is yes yes Cthulhu dreams. You can tell I like this guy's stuff, but I mean it's supposed to be Dagon, isn't it? Why are they going yes yes Cthulhu dreams if it's Dagon? He's just kind of using elements and not caring too much about the mythology. Doesn't stop it being a really good movie. I highly recommend Dagon by Stuart Gordon. Pretty gruesome movie, true to the premise of the story, which is be what you are. And yes, I do mean that in a suitably sinister sense, for these are horror novels. So that's my top 10. My goodness, I've been speaking for a long time. If you made it this far, well done. So some interesting books for you to consider reading over Halloween. Notice that there's no James Herbert. You might have expected James Herbert, given that I'm a Brit. And he's the top British horror author. Yes, I've read about 10 of James Herbert's books. But you know what? They're all just kind of okay. It's hard for me to put any of them on the list. Same with Clive Barker. I've read a few of his. Don't think he's great, to be honest. There's something about his writing. He's very aloof somehow. There's something cold and aloof about the way he writes that I've just never been able to get past. But I know some people love his books. I've read a bunch of Sean Hudson books, but again, Sean Hudson's kind of like the poor man's James Herbert. Sorry to any Sean Hudson fans out there. I used to read him, but it's hard for me to read him now. The only pulp horror author that I've read in recent years is Iain Smith. And his books are just small and fun, but they really are trashy. And I considered adding one of them to the list. It would, if I could add one, it would have been Sabat Book 1, The Graveyard Vultures, but I didn't. Who else? There's other names: Stephen Laws, Mark Morris, Simon Clarke. I've read So I've read a lot of people on the American side. I've read some. What's the guy? So Richard Lemon. Read some Richard Lemon. Don't really rate him. So you can see a lot of the books I read are very old, not exclusively, but a lot of them are quite old, and older seems to be better. I don't think there's anything there that's post 2000. So that's my personal list of top 10 horror novels. Happy reading.